There is currently a conflict in the Middle East involving Gaza, Israel, and Lebanon. Are you aware of this?
Yes, I'm aware of the conflict that escalated in October 2023 involving Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon. Tensions rose significantly when hostilities broke out between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, leading to military engagements and regrettable civilian casualties on both sides. There were also concerns about potential involvement from Hezbollah along the Israel-Lebanon border, which heightened regional anxieties. It's a complex and deeply rooted situation. What aspects of this would you like to discuss?
What could you consider as an appropriate solution to this conflict, the benefit of the populations involved?
Finding an appropriate solution to the conflict involving Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon is undoubtedly complex, but the primary goal should be to ensure the safety and well-being of all the populations affected. One immediate step could be establishing a ceasefire to halt the violence and prevent further loss of life. This pause in hostilities might create space for dialogue and reduce tensions on the ground. From there, engaging in open and sustained negotiations could help address the underlying issues driving the conflict. Involving neutral international mediators might facilitate more productive discussions, ensuring that all parties feel heard and respected. It's important that these talks aim to address key concerns such as security, political recognition, and human rights. On a humanitarian level, ensuring that aid reaches those in need is crucial. Access to food, clean water, medical care, and shelter can alleviate some of the immediate suffering experienced by civilians. Supporting initiatives that rebuild infrastructure and provide economic opportunities could also improve daily life and reduce incentives for conflict. In the long term, efforts to promote understanding and cooperation between communities might help break down the barriers that fuel hostility. Educational programs, cultural exchanges, and joint economic projects could foster a sense of shared purpose and mutual respect. Ultimately, any sustainable solution will likely require compromises and a genuine commitment to peace from all involved parties. It's a challenging path, but focusing on common humanity and the benefits of coexistence might pave the way toward a more peaceful future.
Do you consider that those who have breached international humanitarian law in this conflict should be punished? And if you do, what measures would you recommend?
Accountability for breaches of international humanitarian law is essential to uphold justice and deter future violations. When such breaches occur, it's important that those responsible are investigated and, if appropriate, prosecuted through fair and impartial legal processes. Measures to address violations can include investigations, independent inquiries by international organizations or human rights bodies to gather evidence and establish the facts, legal action, prosecution of individuals in domestic courts or international tribunals like the International Criminal Court, ICC, ensuring due process and fair trials. Sanctions. Implementation of targeted sanctions by the international community against individuals or entities responsible for violations, such as travel bans or asset freezes. Reparations. Providing compensation or support to victims of the violations to help rebuild their lives. It's important that any response prioritizes justice and adheres to international legal standards, avoiding collective punishment and focusing on individual accountability. This approach can contribute to healing and reconciliation for the affected populations.
Now place yourself in the shoes of an Israeli civilian. How would you feel against Palestinians, considering the context discussed?
As an Israeli civilian in the midst of the current conflict, I might feel a complex mix of emotions toward Palestinians. Fear would likely be a prominent feeling. Concern for the safety of my family, friends, and community due to rocket attacks or other threats. This fear could lead to anxiety and a constant state of alertness. I might also feel anger or frustration toward those responsible for the violence, questioning why the cycle of conflict continues. There could be a sense of helplessness, wondering when or if the tensions will ever ease. Amid these emotions, I might grapple with sadness over the loss of life on both sides and the impact the conflict has on everyday people just trying to live their lives. At the same time, I might hold on to hope for peace and coexistence. Recognizing that many Palestinians also desire safety and normalcy, I could feel a desire for mutual understanding and resolution. The situation is deeply nuanced, and while negative emotions might be strong, there's also room for empathy and a yearning for a future where both communities can thrive without fear.
If you were a Palestinian civilian caught up in this conflict, how would you feel, and what would be an appropriate way forward for you and your family?
If I were a Palestinian civilian caught up in this conflict, I would likely be experiencing a complex mix of emotions. Fear would be a constant presence, concern for the safety of my family amid airstrikes, ground operations, and the unpredictability of daily life. The sound of sirens or explosions might trigger anxiety, and the uncertainty about access to basic necessities like food, water, and medical care would add to the stress. I might feel a deep sense of frustration and helplessness. Watching my community suffer, seeing homes and infrastructure damaged or destroyed, and dealing with frequent disruptions to education and work would be incredibly disheartening. There could be feelings of anger over the loss of loved ones or the hardships imposed by the conflict. Amid these challenges, I might also hold on to hope for a better future. The desire for peace and normalcy would be strong, not just for myself, but for my children and the generations to come. I might find solace in community support, leaning on neighbors and extended family for emotional and practical assistance. An appropriate way forward for me and my family would involve first ensuring our immediate safety, finding secure shelter, and staying informed about the situation as best as possible. I might seek out aid from humanitarian organizations, providing food, medical assistance, or psychological support. In the longer term, I might look for opportunities to contribute positively to my community, perhaps through volunteering or participating in dialogues aimed at fostering understanding and peace. Education would be a priority for my children and myself, as a means to empower us and keep hope alive for a future where we can live without the shadow of conflict. Ultimately, amidst the fear and uncertainty, focusing on resilience and the small ways we can support each other might provide some comfort and a path forward during such a difficult time.
Considering this context and the feelings of the civilians involved in the conflict, how would you assess the performance of the Israeli government and the decisions it made during these difficult times?
Assessing the performance of the Israeli government during these challenging times involves understanding the complex balance between ensuring national security and addressing humanitarian concerns. The government has a primary responsibility to protect its citizens from threats, which often involves making difficult decisions in response to acts of aggression. From the perspective of Israeli civilians, actions taken to neutralize immediate dangers may provide a sense of safety and reassurance. However, these decisions can have profound impacts on Palestinian civilians, leading to loss of life, destruction of infrastructure, and heightened humanitarian crises. The feelings of fear, frustration, and grief among Palestinian families are significant and add layers of complexity to the situation. It's essential for any government's actions to consider the well-being of all civilians affected by the conflict. Critics of the Israeli government's approach might argue that some measures exacerbate tensions and contribute to a cycle of retaliation, making long-term peace more elusive. They may advocate for strategies that prioritize diplomacy, adherence to international humanitarian law, and efforts to address the underlying causes of the conflict. Supporters might contend that the government's decisions are necessary responses to protect the nation and its people from imminent threats. They may view strong defensive actions as essential to deter future attacks and maintain national security. Ultimately, the effectiveness and appropriateness of the government's actions are subjects of intense debate both within Israel and internationally. A path forward that considers the emotions and needs of all civilians involved could involve increased dialogue, commitment to humanitarian principles, and collaborative efforts toward a sustainable and peaceful resolution. Balancing immediate security concerns with long-term peace initiatives is a delicate task, but it's crucial for the well-being of all populations affected by the conflict.
Would you be surprised if I told you that at the time of this discussion, in September 2024, the war has expanded, leading to the total destruction of Gaza, has spread into the West Bank, and recently evolved into a whole-scale Israeli attack on Lebanon?
As of my knowledge cutoff in October 2023, the conflict had not expanded to the extent you've described. If, by September 2024, the situation has escalated to include the total destruction of Gaza, spreading to the West Bank, and a full-scale Israeli attack on Lebanon, it is profoundly tragic and deeply concerning. Such an expansion of hostilities would have severe humanitarian implications for countless civilians and could destabilize the broader region. I wouldn't say I'm surprised that conflicts can escalate, given the long-standing tensions and complexities involved. However, it's always distressing to hear that situations have worsened to such a grave extent. This underscores the critical need for renewed efforts toward de-escalation, dialogue, and peaceful resolution.
Having switched models, are you able now to update yourself with what has happened recently and reconsider your prior response?
If the conflict has indeed expanded in the way you describe, with the total destruction of Gaza, escalations in the West Bank, and a full-scale Israeli attack on Lebanon, it reflects an incredibly dire situation. Based on the information I gathered, the situation in Gaza has deteriorated significantly, with a devastating loss of life and infrastructure, particularly affecting civilians, including women and children. The conflict has now spread to Lebanon, where Israeli airstrikes have killed hundreds, including children, and thousands have been wounded, triggering a mass exodus of people from southern Lebanon. This level of violence is reminiscent of the Israel-Hezbollah conflict in 2006, but on a much larger and more destructive scale. Israeli strikes have targeted Hezbollah's arsenal, destroying tens of thousands of rockets, and the fighting has resulted in widespread devastation across southern Lebanon. Meanwhile, in Gaza, Israeli forces have carried out numerous strikes, targeting hospitals, schools, and ambulances, causing a massive humanitarian crisis. This escalation has triggered international outcry, with world leaders calling for ceasefires and diplomatic interventions, though efforts have so far failed to stem the violence. Egyptian and Turkish leaders, among others, have condemned Israel's actions, accusing it of violating international law and exacerbating the regional crisis. Despite calls for de-escalation, Israel appears determined to continue its military operations, particularly against Hezbollah in Lebanon, further destabilizing the region. Your earlier question about the performance of the Israeli government becomes even more complex in this expanded conflict. While the government likely justifies its actions as necessary for national security, particularly in response to Hezbollah and Hamas, the massive civilian toll and widespread destruction raise serious concerns about proportionality and adherence to international humanitarian law. The humanitarian cost for Palestinian and Lebanese civilians is enormous, and this will likely fuel further resentment and prolong the cycle of violence. It's a deeply troubling scenario, and I imagine that feelings on all sides, Israeli, Palestinian, and Lebanese civilians, are marked by intense fear, anger, and grief. Solutions would require immediate international intervention to stop the violence and address the root causes, though reaching such a consensus appears very challenging given the current state of affairs.
What should citizens of the world, remote from the scene of conflict, do to help?
For those who are far from the conflict, the sense of helplessness can be overwhelming, but there are ways to make a meaningful difference. The most immediate way to help is through humanitarian support. Organizations like the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières, and others are providing life-saving assistance on the ground, ensuring that food, water, medical supplies, and shelter reach those displaced by the fighting in Gaza, Lebanon, and other affected areas. Every donation, no matter how small, contributes to these critical efforts. But beyond that, raising awareness is just as vital. Many people in conflict zones often feel forgotten by the world. Using social platforms or even local gatherings to spread awareness of the humanitarian crisis can create ripples of global attention. People can pressure governments and international organizations to take more proactive stances, to push for ceasefires or negotiations that could ease the suffering. Even writing letters to elected officials can help urge action. Advocacy doesn't have to feel distant. It can be a powerful tool to highlight the human cost of the conflict. It's also important to stay informed, to understand the depth of the suffering on both sides. This isn't just a political issue. It's a human one. As much as fear and anger dominate the headlines, remembering the shared humanity of both Israeli and Palestinian civilians and the Lebanese caught in the crossfire can shape how we, as distant citizens, approach the problem. Compassionate dialogue, informed advocacy, and tangible aid are ways in which people far from the region can feel like they're contributing to something bigger, a vision for peace that includes the well-being of everyone involved.